The boarding line at Gate 27 looked like every other boarding line in every other airport. A blend of business travelers in sharp suits, families juggling strollers and juice boxes, and tired vacationers clutching neck pillows like lifelines. But among them, in her quiet way, was an older woman with silver-streaked hair tied in a no-nonsense bun. She wore no uniform, no medals, no visible sign that she was anything more than another name on the passenger manifest. Her boarding pass read, 14C. She smiled politely as she shuffled forward, one hand clutching a faded leather satchel. The edges were worn soft, the stitching almost unraveling, as though the bag itself carried decades of secrets. She moved with the careful precision of someone who once knew what it meant to carry both herself and others with steady strength. To the flight attendants, she was simply Ms. Elaine Carter. To the TSA agent, she was an ID check, a nod, have a nice flight. To the pilot in the cockpit, she was another soul among hundreds, a responsibility to carry safely from Washington, D.C. to Denver. But to history, if only it remembered, she was Eagle One. Elaine settled into 14C, the aisle seat. A young man in 14A immediately lowered his window shade to continue his video game. A woman in 14B tapped out work emails with the brisk staccato of someone who didn't want conversation. That suited Elaine fine. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to travel. Still, her eyes drifted toward the window. 30 years ago, she would have given anything to sit in the cockpit, not in coach. She used to say the air belonged to her as much as the ground did. She had once commanded wings of steel and fire, not tray tables and complimentary pretzels. But time is relentless. The sky no longer belonged to her, it belonged to others now. Or so she thought. The plane took off smoothly, lifting into the twilight sky. Elaine closed her eyes during ascent, not out of fear, but from the habit of listening. She could tell, even from 14C, whether the engines strained too hard, whether the climb was steady, whether the pilot was aggressive or gentle on the stick. The habits of a lifetime never leave you. Hours later, turbulence rattled the cabin. Seatbelt lights blinked on, and a few passengers murmured. Elaine barely moved. She had faced turbulence of a different kind. Flak bursts, missile locks, radios that screamed warnings. Compared to those days, this was nothing. Then came the announcement. Calm, professional, but edged with urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to maintain a holding pattern due to restricted airspace ahead. Nothing to worry about. We'll keep you updated. Elaine's ears sharpened. Restricted airspace. Over Kansas. That wasn't normal. It wasn't long before the entire plane felt the low rumble. A sound not from the engines, but from outside. Passengers peered through the windows. Some gasped. A few even clapped, assuming it was some kind of patriotic escort. 2 F-16 fighter jets had pulled alongside the commercial airliner, their sleek gray bodies cutting through the clouds. Children squealed in delight, pressing their faces to the glass. Adults whispered nervously. Phones tried to capture grainy photos through scratched windows. Elaine, however, simply watched. Calm, unreadable. She knew exactly what it meant. Fighters didn't just show up unless there was a reason. The captain came over the intercom again, voice slightly tenser now. Folks, we're experiencing a communications issue with air traffic control. Standard procedure requires military escort until it's resolved. Please remain calm. But Elaine's eyes stayed locked on the lead F-16. Something about its flight path, the way it held just slightly closer, the tilt of its wing. She recognized it as a signal. A question. A silent language of the skies. Her heart stirred. She hadn't used it in decades. But it was muscle memory, ingrained in her bones. She reached into her satchel. Her fingers brushed against an old, worn patch. It bore her call sign, faded but still legible. Eagle One. The captain's voice trembled again as he added, "We are trying to re-establish comms, so sit tight." But outside, the lead F-16 pilot suddenly seemed distracted. He was glancing into the cabin windows as though searching. His wing dipped again. A message. Elaine did something no one expected. She reached up, unlatched her reading light, and began tapping it deliberately. On, off, on, off. A precise rhythm, not random. Morse code. The young man in 14A frowned. Ma'am, what are you doing?" Answering, Elaine said simply, her eyes never leaving the jet outside. The light blinked. EAGLEONE. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the F-16 jolted, banking left, then right in sharp recognition. The universal airborne salute of acknowledgement. The co-pilot must have radioed something urgent, because within moments, the formation shifted. The second fighter dropped slightly back, as if yielding. The lead F-16 edged closer, cockpit nearly level with Elaine's row. Through the glass canopy, she could just make out the pilot's wide eyes. His lips formed words she couldn't hear, but she could read them as clearly as if they'd been shouted. Eagle 1. Elaine simply nodded. The pilot snapped a salute. Crisp, sharp, reverent. The entire cabin gasped. No one knew what was happening. All they saw was a combat jet outside saluting a woman in seat 14C. And in that instant, the sky remembered her. The murmurs in the cabin grew fevered. Who is she? Why did he salute her? Is she famous? Is she military? The flight attendants hovered, curious but hesitant. Elaine gave them only a small smile. It's all right, she said softly. They just recognized an old friend. But inside, her chest ached with something far greater than nostalgia. She had thought her name, her call sign, had been forgotten. She had lived decades quietly, away from the noise of glory, medals, and parades. And yet, up here, above the clouds, two young warriors still knew the name Eagle 1. The plane's captain came out of the cockpit, something few passengers ever witnessed mid-flight. His face was pale with disbelief as he approached her row. Ma'am, he said carefully, almost reverently, the fighters outside, they just relayed a message to us. They want confirmation. Were you, Eagle 1? Elaine exhaled slowly. She had never thought she'd hear that call sign spoken aloud again. Yes, she said simply. And with that, the cabin erupted in whispers that would soon turn into something far greater. The cabin had fallen into a reverent hush. Elaine Carter, just Elaine, a moment ago, was no longer just the quiet passenger in 14C. She was someone else, someone who carried a name whispered with awe through the radio channels of the F-16s outside. The captain still stood beside her seat, as if reluctant to move until she answered his unspoken question. Passengers leaned over armrests, peered between seatbacks, waiting. Even the toddler who had been crying since takeoff was suddenly quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Yes, Elaine repeated, more firmly this time. I was Eagle 1, a past few knew. It began in 1991, in skies much less forgiving. Elaine Carter had been one of the first female combat pilots to fly in the U.S. Air Force during the Gulf War. At a time when women were still doubted, still told they didn't belong in the cockpit of a fighter jet, Elaine had pushed forward. With steel in her spine and fire in her heart. Her call sign, Eagle 1, wasn't chosen lightly. She had earned it. She had flown missions over hostile airspace, led squadrons through impossible odds, and, on one night that lived in whispered legend, she had made the decision that saved an entire wing from annihilation. She had vanished from the headlines after her retirement. No memoir, no speeches. She had traded the roar of engines for the quiet of small-town living, believing her days in the sky belonged only to history books and fading memories. But history, it seemed, had a way of remembering when you least expected it. The message from the sky. The captain crouched slightly to lower his voice, though the whole cabin strained to hear. Ma'am, he said, the pilots outside, they said it's an honor. They asked if you'd accept a formal salute. Elaine blinked. Her throat tightened. Up here, now, he nodded. They said the sky is the right place. Her chest rose and fell. For years, she had buried Eagle 1 beneath the folds of civilian life. But something inside her, something that had slept for decades, stirred awake. She gave a small nod. The captain touched his earpiece, relaying the message. Outside, the two F-16s broke formation with sharp precision. The entire cabin craned toward the windows. Passengers gasped as the jets crossed over each other in a sweeping arc, then pulled into a perfect wing salute, sleek steel birds bowing in the sky. And then, almost impossibly, the lead jet rolled just enough for its pilot to press a gloved hand to his helmet in a crisp salute, holding it steady toward the very row where Elaine sat. 14C. The entire plane went silent. Tears welled in the eyes of strangers who had boarded that flight thinking it would be just another business trip, another vacation, another commute. Instead, they were witnessing history brush against the present, like lightning caught in their hands. The young man in 14A set down his game console, staring at Elaine as though seeing her for the first time. The woman in 14B, who hadn't looked up from her emails for hours, closed her laptop and whispered, "Thank you." And then, slowly, awkwardly at first, but with growing strength, the passengers began to applaud. Not the kind of applause meant for entertainment, but the kind that rose from the marrow of gratitude. The sound filled the cabin, echoing against the aluminum walls, rolling forward and back until it became a standing ovation 30,000 feet above the earth. Elaine's hands trembled in her lap. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't wanted it. And yet, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel it. Not pride, not vanity, but remembrance. As the applause softened, Elaine's eyes drifted back to the clouds beyond the glass. She remembered nights in the desert when she had flown low, radar screaming, heart hammering against the edges of her ribcage. She remembered voices over the radio, young, steady, sometimes scared, depending on her command to bring them home. She remembered the sound of silence in the debriefing rooms when empty chairs marked the ones who hadn't made it back. And she remembered, too, the day she had walked away from it all, hanging up her helmet for the last time, certain the world no longer needed Eagle One. But maybe, she thought, Eagle One had never been hers to bury. Maybe Eagle One belonged to all of them, the ones who had flown beside her, the ones who had not come home, the ones who now flew overhead keeping watch. Elaine drew a breath, straightened in her seat, and raised her hand to her brow. The gesture was slow, deliberate, her wrist stiff from age but her form still sharp with memory. A salute, answering the ones outside. The lead F-16 dipped its wing in acknowledgement, then peeled upward with a roar that rattled the windows. Its partner followed, engines blazing trails of thunder into the clouds, vanishing into the vastness from which they had come. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The plane hummed on, steady and small against the infinity of the sky. Elaine lowered her hand. Aftermath at 30,000 feet. When the captain returned to the cockpit, whispers spread like wildfire through the cabin. A young boy across the aisle leaned over. "Ma'am, were you really a fighter pilot?" Elaine smiled gently. "I was part of a team. The best team." Another passenger asked, "Why haven't we heard about you?" Elaine chuckled softly. "Because the sky doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who flies it, and everyone they protect." The woman in 14B reached for Elaine's hand. "Thank you, for all of it." Elaine squeezed back. She wanted to say something profound, but the truth was simple. "It was my honor." Hours later, when the wheels touched down in Denver, the passengers didn't leap to their feet as usual. They waited, almost ceremonially, as if sensing they should not break the spell of what had happened in the sky. As Elaine rose from 14C, her satchel over her shoulder, the entire cabin turned toward her. Some placed hands over hearts. Others simply bowed their heads. And as she walked down the narrow aisle, a ripple of respect followed her, row after row rising to their feet in silent tribute. At the door, the captain stood at attention. He saluted her. The flight attendants, misty-eyed, did the same. Elaine paused, returned the salute, and then stepped into the terminal. Epilogue. When legends live quietly. Outside the gate, the world bustled as it always did, families rushing to baggage claim, business travelers checking watches, announcements echoing overhead. No one there knew that the quiet woman passing through had once been Eagle One. And that was fine, because somewhere high above, two young pilots still carried her name back to their squadron, their voices crackling with awe over the comms. "You won't believe who we escorted today. Eagle One." And in the hearts of 100 passengers who would never forget Flight 227 on that ordinary Tuesday, the legend of the passenger in 14C lived on, reminding them that sometimes, heroes sit quietly among us, unnoticed until the sky itself remembers. She was only a passenger in 14C, until the F-16 pilots heard her call sign, saluted the legend she was, and reminded the world that the skies never forget their own.